What is schizophrenia? Chances are when you heard that, you conjured up an image in your mind. Maybe it was Russell Crowe as John Nash in A Beautiful Mind. Maybe you pictured someone with multiple personalities. This isn't actually a symptom of schizophrenia, by the way. That's a common misconception. Actually, there are a lot of misconceptions about this disease, and today we're going to hear from a man who deals with this disease every day. Steve Einhaus has paranoid schizophrenia. His life story includes a couple of psychotic episodes, an altercation with police, a near-death experience, and a faith-filled recovery. And he's going to tell us all about it right now. Welcome to Drawn, the podcast that draws you in with stories of hope, healing, and even a little hustle while battling anxiety and depression. Think you have to wait until you've conquered your mental illness to start living a joyful, meaningful life? Think again. Conquering your mental illness is part of living a life you love, and we're going to figure it out together. I'm Katie Rachetko, and this is Drawn. Well, Steve, welcome to the Drawn podcast. I am so excited that you are here with us today.
Thanks for having me. This is a real opportunity and a real treat, and I'm honored to be here.
Well, the honor is all mine. So I have the privilege of knowing you through my dad. My dad speaks very highly of you, and I know a little bit of your story. But to set the stage, I guess, for our listeners, can you introduce us to yourself and really what it is that you do right now?
Well, I'm Steve, and I'm a peer specialist at Eastern State Hospital, which means I have the lived experience of having a mental illness. And I have three core functions. I do groups that are what we call the treatment mall, which is kind of classes for people with mental health issues or major mental illness. So I do classes, I help with the complaint resolution process, and I do talks in the community to enlighten people about mental illness, especially the one I have, which is schizophrenia, and that there's hope and that it can be overcome with three things, medication, therapy, and support. So I take my message to the patients. I've been hospitalized twice at Eastern State Hospital and come out the other end and had some real good success with my life. And I try to impart that, some of the roadblocks and some of the things that have worked for me to the patients in hope that they can get out and have successful lives too.
What a beautiful mission, and I love that you just basically dove right in and said exactly what it is that you deal with, schizophrenia, and I know we're going to really get to that part of your story, but if you don't mind, I'd love to go back to kind of the beginning and learn a little bit about your childhood and how that shaped you into the person you are today.
Well, I started off in Seattle, Washington. I was born at Husky Hospital, but I was shipped over to Spokane at 6 weeks old. And growing up, I grew up with my paternal grandparents, my father's parents. So I thought, why am I so different? I grew up on the Upper South Hill, which was kind of a nice part of Spokane. And I thought, why am I with my grandparents and everybody else around me has their nuclear families, their siblings, and I'm kind of in this strange world where I don't. So growing up, I knew my mother on the periphery, but I didn't know what she had gone through. I thought she had a really bad drug problem because she lived a really poor life, a real poor quality of life, and that she was always telling me how her boyfriends beat her up and stole her welfare checks, and she had really odd facial tics. She was overweight, and she just said things that didn't make any sense. So growing up with a mom who had what I thought was a drug addiction, and with a dad who had not been there for me, was kind of tough. I went to Ferris High School on the South Hill. I was an honor student there, got really good grades. I played football, I played basketball. I wasn't a great athlete, but I was tall and big, so they used me on the line and as a center. And my athletic prowess wasn't the best, but I love to read. I still do to this day. I love to read. And school came easy for me as a natural. I just really enjoyed the atmosphere of school, the structure, the ability to excel and be in classes with other people who excelled. And, until about 20 years old, things were okay in my life, I thought. One thing about me that happened is around 16 or 17, socially I started falling apart and I didn't realize it. In other words, as my friends were blossoming and starting to go out on dates and starting to relate to the opposite sex, I was starting to go inward and turn introverted more than I should have. And I really didn't get a chance to relate to people on that kind of level that my friends were, and I didn't know why. I always wondered why I was different, not just because of my growing up with grandparents, but I thought there was something really wrong with me, but I didn't know what it was. So about 17 or 18, it started manifesting when I went to college. And all this is in retrospect, looking back. I stopped changing clothes for weeks at a time. I didn't shave. I didn't take care of my hygiene. And I really had a hard time making friends. And I was just really judgmental and going through a lot. But I thought it was all due to the fact that I was on my own for the first time so I could make my own decisions. Little did I know how poor they were and how abnormal they were. I kind of retreated to the library and I was a bookworm and I would, go to study carols and read a lot or maybe play a little basketball here and there and lift weights. But inside and in my head, there was a lot of stuff going wrong.
Wow. I think one of the interesting things is that we often assume that mental health issues come out of major trauma. And sometimes we don't understand that, like you had a relatively good life. And yeah, there was some things that, you can look back on and see that, maybe influenced your mental health, but you did have a really good life. And so sometimes I think people with mental health feel guilty about dealing with these issues as if their childhood was somehow to blame. How do you react to that?
That is a really good observation. Mental illness isn't a character defect, at least the ones I have. I don't think it is.
No.
It's a biological thing in your brain. It's really important for people to know that it's not something I wish on anybody else. It's not something I wish I had, and it's not something that I created. Something that was hardwired into me from birth that exacerbated itself at 20 years old, and it hasn't gone away. I think if there's one thing I wish people would know, it's that mental illness is a no fault thing. It's not my fault I have it. It's not society's fault that I have it. It's just one of those things.
Wow. Well, I think that's a really good point, and I think that I wish that a lot of people understood that too, because we want, in a lot of ways in life, we want to play the blame game. We want somebody to be able to take responsibility for something that we have deemed as wrong or not right in our life. So it's really interesting to hear that from you, and I'm really curious to now. We've kind of led up all the way up to 20 years old, and I have a feeling that that's kind of where something pretty major happened in your life, right?
Absolutely. I'm not going to talk too much about it. It's something that's kind of really personal. It changed my life. I'll put it this way: I was going to college. I was in my sophomore year, and I started thinking, for instance, that my professor was my heavenly father, my ethics professor. So unfortunately, I went up to him and apologized for all my sins and asked for absolution from him. And I didn't get it. I started thinking my grandparents' hot chocolate was poison, so I dumped 5 canisters down the toilet. And then as my illness started to progress, I got worse. And I thought that the FBI was surveilling my house and the CIA was tapping the phones and they were out to get me. And when I'd see cars parked in the cul-de-sac across the street from us, I'd think that they were surveillance vehicles, or if a police officer happened to drive by, I'd think that they were coming to get me. Um, and as the psychosis got worse and the schizophrenia started to form, uh, it happened very quickly. And by very quickly, I mean I went from being an honor student in college, carrying a good GPA, to being on the forensic unit at Eastern State Hospital in about 12 weeks. They were what they call prodromal symptoms, which means before your first episode. But the big one happened on December 15th, 1995. And I thought I had a message from God to do something that I really didn't. And I ended up in jail. I ended up trying to commit suicide in jail. And so they took me to Eastern State Hospital, and that's where the story of my recovery really started.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Now, I've done a little bit of research in preparation for this interview about schizophrenia, but I think it's one of those things that's very misunderstood. And so I'd love to just take a moment and kind of in your own words explain to our listeners what schizophrenia is, or put aside some of those misconceptions that people have about schizophrenia.
The first thing people think about schizophrenia, it's multiple personality disorder. That people have different personalities, and that's bunk. The second thing is people think that it's a character defect, or that a long time ago they felt that having a cold, callous mother caused it. That's not true. What it is a biological chemical process in your brain. I call it hardwired to go haywire. When I turned 20 years old, my brain is structurally different from 99% of the populations. So I had a chemical reaction that caused me to do some bizarre things that are outside the bounds of social norms. Uh, Medication doesn't cure schizophrenia. Medication helps schizophrenia. There is no cure for schizophrenia. And schizophrenia is a lifelong disorder. What I want people to know about it too is that it has 3 sets of symptoms. And if I could really stress one thing, if somebody's listening and their family member or they are going through it, I hope this really helps understand that the person, the loved one, or you, or who are going through it, it's not your fault. There's actually categories of symptoms that encompass what you're going through. First set is positive. That's hearing voices, seeing hallucinations of things that aren't there, and having delusional beliefs. As it's been explained to me, it's all the things that mental illness adds to the equation that weren't there before you had it. So hearing voices is common with schizophrenia. Not everybody with schizophrenia hears voices, but a lot of people do. Mine were in my head. They weren't outside my head. Once in a while, I might hear a whisper outside my head, but mine was my internal monologue turned evil on me. And I'll explain that later. The second one is hallucinations, visual. I didn't have those too bad. But delusions, I was what they call religiously preoccupied, which means I thought everything from being the Antichrist to Jesus Christ, and believe it or not, even at one point the Virgin Mary when I was not doing my best. And religious preoccupation is really common with schizophrenia and psychosis, and we don't know why. The experts don't understand why people think that, but it's just a commonality across the universe or across the world. The second set of symptoms, because the medications really focus right now on positive symptoms, because those are what give people into respite or get them into jail or get them into halfway houses. They're the ones that cause all the problems, the ones that where people act out and act bizarre. The second set of symptoms are negative symptoms. Those are blank affect, which means whenever you try to read a person's face, you can't, because the mental illness just mutes that whole process. I still struggle reading body language, and people sometimes struggle reading me. It's the ultimate poker face. Secondly, it's that social drive, wanting to go out and hang with your friends. That goes away for a long time, and it's really hard to get back. For instance, I mean, it's hard. It takes more energy for me to go out and hang out and be with other people. I'd much rather be by myself. But I do make the time because support is so critical with mental illness. And finally, there's just that whole that whole isolation. If you get sicker, you tend to isolate and sleep more. These are what are called negative symptoms. They're ones that the things that the illness takes away from you socially and emotionally that were there possibly before you got the first psychotic episode. And just to back up, well, a psychotic episode is where your mind goes to a different, I call it a different universe. Some people compare it to a daydream that turns it's real, but you think you're in a dreamlike state. I think you're in a different universe, and you act out and do bizarre things based on the universe that you're in. The third set of symptoms are disorganized. Those disorganized symptoms are um, all related to executive functioning. So whether it be problem solving, scheduling your day, or emotional regulation, all the higher cognitive functions that people have get disrupted because the illness actually they find can cause brain damage to your prefrontal cortex, which is the one that develops last in the brain and is really known for the higher level abstract thinking. So I've been accused a lot of being concrete in my thinking, very black and white, very not being able to catch nuances, because that part of my brain has not fully recovered from this illness. I've gotten a lot better about stuff, but it's still tough. There's a thing called neuroplasticity in the brain where it can actually rewire the way things work, and you can find different ways to come to the same conclusions, but you really have to work hard at it. That's a huge part of recovery, is finding a different way to do something you used to be able to do easily. So you got three sets of symptoms: positive, negative, disorganized. And in that order, the medications, first of all, treat the positive, and then slowly, as the illness starts to go into remission, the negative symptoms start going away, and then the disorganized. So if somebody's out there and they have schizophrenia or a loved one with it, and they think, oh, my family member's lazy, or my family member is slow, or my family member just doesn't try, remember those symptoms and remember them in that order. It's hard to. There's a thing where 30% of people with schizophrenia will not really recover. They're treatment resistant, but there's a whole nother universe where 70% will do okay or recover or actually be able to work a job, and those numbers are getting better by the day. Because as people find more treatment and more medication for schizophrenia, and the medications get better and more nuanced and have less of a side effect profile, all of a sudden you find that people who stay away from drugs and alcohol and who stay on their meds get better. It takes a long time. And if you have a family member or somebody out there who's diagnosed, it's like a broken arm, except it's a broken brain, and the brain takes time to heal. It may take a lot longer than a broken arm, because the psyche is a very fragile thing, and I'll be in recovery and healing for the rest of my life. So that's a nutshell of the mental health issue, schizophrenia, and there's a lot to it.
Yeah.
But that's a breakdown.
Well, thank you so much for that breakdown. I mean, one of my passions is, of course, education. So I really appreciate you taking the time to explain all of that. And I think the thing that's really important to note is that, we compare a lot. It's like if you had a broken arm, you would go and get help for it. So if you have a broken brain, go and get help for it. There's no shame in prioritizing your mental health, seeking help, seeking treatment or therapy or anything like that. But you also have listed a whole bunch of symptoms to schizophrenia, and just like many mental health disorders or illnesses, it looks different in everybody, which is also probably why it's been hard to treat, because there's just so many variations that doctors and scientists have really had to study over the last several decades. Is that accurate to say?
Yeah, you nailed it. And one thing about schizophrenia is it's not an actual illness, it's a syndrome. And I don't fully understand this from a medical perspective, but a syndrome is like diabetes you can treat with insulin because they know your pancreas is doing whatever. Mental illness, they don't know what causes it. They just know it's a brain disorder. So um, a syndrome is there are certain clusters of symptoms that look like mental illness and that over time seem to be prevalent features. But one person could hear voices, another person won't hear voices. One person could have a certain type of delusion, another person might not. But they just clump it all together and call it schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or schizoaffective bipolar type. Point being, they don't know what causes it completely. They just know it's a brain disorder. And there's two kind of modes of prescribing medication: heuristic and analogous. Analogous is where you have a diabetic and they can they can give them insulin and they can measure how well they're doing on their blood sugars. Heuristic is like a doctor explained to me one time. It's like trying to shoot a cannon ball at a moving target on a mountain about a mile away. What the doctors do is they try to find the best match for the person that they're treating with antipsychotics or antidepressants. And it's a moving target, so you don't know quite what you're getting because there's no way to measure how well the medication is working except for the person presenting in front of you.
Wow, that's fascinating. I love the study of medicine, but I'm glad there are a lot more smarter people out there doing that, and I just get to kind of ask the questions and let them tell me the answers. That's really interesting. Now, I'd like to go back to something that you said that really struck me as interesting. You said that your mind turned evil. If you don't mind, I'd love for you to kind of dive into that a little bit more and explain exactly what you meant.
For some reason, when people get psychotic and they get sick, their mind goes to the most debauched places for some reason. I don't know why, and it's not just me. I work at a hospital. I hear what people say. I see what kind of results people have when they get psychotic and not treated. And so I'm not alone in that. It seemed to me like, and this is a biblical concept, people are born into original sin, and the human heart is desperately wicked. And it seemed to me like my subconscious mind just got dredged up into my conscious brain, and it was too much. All the anger and hatred and all the wrong things that I tried to push down and stuff and not think about just came up. For instance, my second hospitalization, I would sit there and I'd have these voices in my head telling me you're fat, you're stupid, you're unlovable, you're destined to die a horrible death. Rinse, repeat. It would just go on and on like a feedback loop, and I couldn't shut up or shut down. I also had times where I thought that I could save the world from annihilation by jumping out of the second story of the hospital windows and dying. I figured I would go to hell, but I'd save humanity, kind of like Christ did, only I'd save him from burning in hell. I don't know why I thought that. Looking back, it's irrational. It makes no sense. But the voices in my head and the things that were going on around my delusional systems were all very, very evil. And one thing I really want to stress, I couldn't control it. It wasn't like I could turn it on or off. It was always on. And I had to psychically fight so hard just to get through a given day because of how the voices were and how my internal monologue was, that it made it really difficult to do much else. One thing about people with mental illness, it may take them a little longer to respond to you when you're talking to them. You may say something, and it may take them 5 seconds. Well, if they have voices in their head, they have to go through the voices first and cut through that to listen to what you're saying, and then hear what you're saying and then respond. It's tough. And so maybe people think you're not listening or paying attention, but people with mental illness are trying. And I don't know why the internal monologue goes so negative and so vile, but it does. And it's usually to destroy yourself or somebody else. And my heroes are people with mental illness who have had it maybe untreated or haven't had the treatment I have for a long time, who are still out there fighting the good fight in spite of a mind that's broken, and furthermore that's trying to tell them to destroy themselves.
That is absolutely beautiful, and I know that there's a part of your story, and if you don't want to talk about it, that's fine. But it's a part of the story that my dad has shared with me multiple times, and it involved you kind of getting into a police altercation, and
Yeah,
he's talked about that as a very pivotal turning point for you, and really almost as if that was the lowest of the low, and it was that kind of moment that had to happen for you to kickstart that rebuilding of your life. Would you be comfortable sharing that with us?
absolutely. So I had my first episode in '95. I went back to college. I was going in the summer quarter of 1997, and I was out in Cheney, Washington, at Eastern Washington University. I was taking the summer quarter, and I was on a real low dose of Risperdal, which is an antipsychotic, and it failed. It failed miserably and spectacularly. And once again I went downhill. I thought my roommate was Satan or an operative of the devil. I threatened to kill my roommate. I started just doing some bizarre things. And then finally, about the time I was about ready to break down again, I thought my medication was poison. So I stopped taking it. I thought, this is doing me no good. It's actually harming me. And so then all hell broke loose in my head again. Not that it wasn't, but it just got worse and worse and worse. The day I broke down, I was in a state of delirium at least, and uh, I just the psychosis is a funny thing. It shifts on you. It's like you try to appease the psychosis, the psychotic thoughts, and then once you've done one thing, it shifts to another, and then another and another. It's like the labors of Hercules. Let me give you the example. So the first thing I thought was, well, your old dorm room is the kingdom of heaven. Why, I don't know. But I broke into my old dorm room, and there was nobody in there, and all of a sudden it shifted. And it said, you need to go to the kitchen and get a kitchen knife. And I don't remember if I was going to go after my father or if I was going to kill myself, but destroy something or someone. So I went to the kitchen, picked up a kitchen knife, and as that was happening, then it said, well, now what do I do next? I have a kitchen knife. Well, pull the fire alarm because the world's coming to an end. It shifted completely all the time. And then all of a sudden I was thinking we're going to have Armageddon too. I pulled the fire alarm. Long story short, I was really goofed up in the head, and the fire department showed up, and I was walking down Elm Street with a knife, and the police showed up too. It was kind of, in my mind, a cry for help, and just I couldn't stop the symptoms. I couldn't stop the pain of what was going on, and I was living in my life for someone else's. So what happened was I started walking, and the police said, put down the knife, and I wouldn't do it. And like Officer Bart Stevens, who was on the scene, said I had that 1,000-yard stare where you're looking at somebody, where you're kind of looking through them, and they can tell you're not all there. There's something wrong. And so as I started picking up my pace on Elm Street, I started hearing louder and louder, put down the knife, but I wasn't there. I was like, lights are on, nobody's home, he's checked out. Well, Bart drew his gun, and I started running, and Bart said I lunged at him. And I don't remember if I was going to lunge and hit my throat or go at him, but right about 10 feet before he should have shot me way before then, but one of the fire guys tripped me. And I went head over tea kettle onto the pavement, and still clasping the knife, they got the knife out of my hands. Now I thought, well, you're on a mission from God. not so don't tell them anything about your mission. So they realized they probably knew before, but they knew something was wrong, and jail wasn't the right place for me at that time. They took me down to the Sacred Heart Psych Ward. I was on the psych ward. I don't remember that stay there very well. I remember they took me right out to Eastern State Hospital, and I was on the adult psych unit. A week later, I got some paperwork that said, the police won't press charges against you if you don't press charges against us. Because during that containment, they had beat me pretty bad on the arms, and the whole purpose was to try to get the knife out of my hand, and I wouldn't let it go, and I couldn't feel pain either. So it's kind of a bad combination, but they got me pretty good, and frankly, I deserved it because they were trying to, public welfare. If I turned on somebody else, it could have gotten really bad. And thank God nobody got hurt. Well, 10 years later, this is the good part of this story. Bart was sitting in what we call crisis intervention team training, and he heard my story and recognized that he was the cop who almost shot me. And now we talk to the Spokane Police Department about my end of the story, his end of the story, and why mentally ill people aren't the people you're after. As a police officer, you're after the bad guys. They don't want to hurt the mentally ill, and differentiating a little bit a psychotic episode from possible drug abuse and a character disorder from a psychiatric disorder. So my whole message is, if you can think about it as an officer, don't shoot.
Wow, and you know that police officers, especially nowadays, they are under enormous stress, enormous pressure. All eyes are on them. And so to have a message like that, I mean, it must be very powerful to be able to go into law enforcement offices, you and Bart, and share your story from both perspectives. I mean, what is that like? What's the reaction you get when you share that story?
Usually it's pretty positive,
I
very
bet.
positive, and that's good. The first time we shared, Bart and I, there was a huge tension there. We've done it 20 times. We become pretty good friends in the process. And I really think highly of Bart. I'm really glad that he stepped forward to say, hey, this story needs to be heard. And Bart, it's funny. I make Bart's points for him, and he makes my points for me about mental illness.
Wow.
So Bart's actually, he reflected on the whole thing, and I think he realized what mental illness really is, and now he's out there being an advocate too in his own way.
That's amazing. So
It is.
that night in 1997, I mean, could you have died that night?
Easily.
Wow.
Easily. Oh yeah. I mean, I should have been shot 20 paces before. And Bart says that with the tactics he knows today, he would have filled me full of lead, and it would have been justified. And I understand that. The interesting thing is, he was 3 weeks out of the police academy, and he didn't know better. And thank goodness he didn't.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's where, in my mind, divine intervention came in. If it had been a seasoned officer, if it had been somebody else, if I hadn't tripped on that guy's shoe, there would be no me.
Wow.
So I think God stepped in and said, hey, and he's given me, in the first episode, in my mind, was even worse. So I'm not going to talk about it, but it was, I could be dead from that too.
Wow. So when you think back about both of those episodes, and I know that the story of you and Bart is something that you've told over and over and over again, so what stands out to you the most about that story?
The thing that stands out most is that something really horrific can be turned around to help other people. It's not the story itself that stands out anymore. It's how Bart and I have used that story to try to enlighten police officers to save mental ill lives.
Wow. That's beautiful. I'm kind of speechless right now because obviously, like I said, I've heard the story from my dad, but hearing it from you and knowing that you were able to take what was probably one of the worst nights of your life, having this kind of psychotic episode, and now God has used it for good. It reminds me of the story of Joseph, being sold into slavery in Egypt, and he came back and he told his brothers, what you intended for evil, God intended for good. And
Yeah.
we need to remember that in our low points, I think. And so I'm blown away by the story again, hearing it, directly from you. So I'd love to get to that positive side of things. You've already mentioned that you've been able to go and have these talks with law enforcement, but after you were hospitalized, I know it wasn't just an immediate turnaround for good. I mean, I'm
No,
sure there was a
no.
lot of recovery there. I'd love to talk a little bit about that, but then, of course, just go into how you got from being a patient to now being a peer advocate.
Perfect. So after that 6 months, I spent 6 months at Eastern State Hospital. And I always say it's the best 6 months of my recovery because I got stable enough on medication 23 years ago that when I got out, I haven't come back as a patient. So that's if nothing else, if I have no feathers in my cap besides I haven't been a patient in a mental hospital in 23 years, that's good enough. But something else happened. There was a confluence of events. I went to a group home and got bored because it wasn't the life for me. So 6 months after I got to the group home, I got out and went to the public housing. Public housing was a godsend because I paid 30% of my meager income for rent. And it was downtown Spokane. It was a perfect location. The housing was not the best, but it was okay. And all of a sudden, there it was. I thought, well, how am I going to occupy my day? So I decided to go back to school and get my degree in economics, which I did. I wasn't on the best meds at the time, but I got it. And I started to work. I worked a job as a telemarketer. It wasn't a very glamorous job, and it wasn't a lot of fun, but it paid my way through college. Because I was 24 years old, I was not a dependent on my folks, so the state basically paid my way through my junior and senior year of college, along with a federal Pell Grant, and I had no worries. I graduated in 2002, and then I started looking at the job market, and I was like, I'm not prepared for the job market. My education was really good, but my employability was really low because somehow my intellect stayed intact from all the assaults my brain had taken, but my employability was, I mean, I was a janitor or a customer service rep at best. And then another thing happened, which was the miracle of modern medication. And around Christmas of 2003, I think, I transitioned to a medication called Abilify. And Abilify changed the game. It is a new antipsychotic. One thing I want to add, first of all, is if you're on a medication that's older and it works, stick with it because if it's working, that's what matters. For me,
Definitely.
newer means better. It's not always the case. Um, so for me, the newer medication worked fantastic. And coupled with Zoloft, which is an antidepressant, I found that 6 months later, all of a sudden I realized I could make a go of my life again. It took 13 years to get on that med regimen where I could make a go of my life again and really make something happen in my career field. Because before then, I was really out of it on those meds. Cyprexageodon, Risperdal, all the ones I'd taken through the wilderness of 13 years of trying to figure out what worked. So after that, I was also volunteering at the hospital that I was once a patient at. I'd been volunteering for a year and a half, and I was doing a speech for an occupational therapy class. And the lady who I was speaking with, who had worked at Eastern State as well, said, "Hey, Steve, I think you might have a job as a peer specialist. First one in the state, first one, one of the first ones in Spokane. And I said, really? I've been working really hard volunteering and trying, and finally it came to fruition.
Wow.
And 13 years later, the thing I'm proudest of is that I'm still here as a state employee. I'm full benefits, fully vested in the retirement system, and I'm helping other people, most importantly, and I make a really good wage here. I mean, it's a living wage. It's a great wage for a single guy. It's fantastic.
Wow.
And I have no complaints about my job at all. I'm so thankful to be here. I told you earlier about what I do. I run groups at the treatment mall. I advocate for patient rights. I help resolve complaints. I give talks. And I talk to patients. And that's my favorite part when I get a chance and I get referred to patients. That's what I do. And I love talking to them, trying to give them hope. And hopefully, and they give me a lot more than I've given them. So, because I see that we're all in this together, that just because I'm a staff member now, I always remember that if something were to happen, I could be a patient very quickly here as well. And so I come up alongside them, the patients, and say, hey, I'm right here in the muck and mire with you because I was not above you, not a doctor, not a social worker, but somebody can come up alongside the person and say, hey, let's walk through this together while you're here. That's really powerful because I've had the experience. I may not know precisely what they're going through, but I sure know the patient experience because I've done it twice. And so it's a pretty cool position to be in.
I'm curious, you've mentioned kind of, here and there you've sprinkled um, points of faith kind of throughout your story. But after the incident with the police, when did faith come back to being a priority in your life, and how did God kind of come back and become that main focal point in your life again?
It was a process because my mind had been destroyed. God got my attention during my first episode. I realized some things that I wasn't in control of myself and I wasn't in control of what was going on. And I realized that the only way that I was going to heal from this was if God is and Christ is who they say they are, and they are, in my opinion. So, anyways, what I think I got once I came working for the hospital again that I'd been a patient at, I think that's when my spiritual journey started getting back on track. My church has done a really good job of accepting me and treating me like everybody else. And the reason probably partially is because they've known me for so long. Before I was diagnosed, our pastor and I went to youth group together. And his dad was the pastor for 27 years. So they kind of knew my story. They knew my grandparents. And they knew what had happened. And they were very welcoming of me in spite of that. The church could do a better job of opening its arms to people with major mental illness who are in recovery and taking responsibility for it and getting their lives back, in my opinion. But it really started when I got the job at the state. Our pastor suggested that we go through our Bibles once a year for a reading plan. And really, that's been my spiritual diet. It's just reading my Bible as many times as I can a week, getting through it once a year. It's a sense of accomplishment, but it also helps me grow spiritually and really reinforces my faith. And I feel like I get a lot of not revelation, but just ideas that'll help me be a better peer.
Wow, that is an amazing testimony to have and really does speak to the wonder and power of God. So I'm curious now as we kind of begin to wrap up. You're on
Yeah.
medication now, you're in therapy, you're doing all these things. So, what is your mental health state of mind right now? Do you still experience some of those schizophrenic symptoms?
I have one persistent delusion and a little bit of a radio station that goes through my head. So the radio station I've had since I was 16. It's kind of interesting. I can hear music in my head at all times if I really listen to it. I can always change the channel, but I can never shut it off except when I'm asleep. It's a real weird thing. Sometimes I think that people talk in code, and I know it's not true, so I have to cognitively and rationally dismiss that. I'm actually no longer in therapy. I got out of therapy 10 years ago,
Wow,
and
okay.
therapy was a lifesaver for me because I worked through a lot of the issues I had when I was sick, and I worked through a lot of my family issues, and the therapists were very, very good at what they did, and it worked. You know, and they gave me hope. They held hope when I didn't have it. And it was kind of funny because with my case, they didn't know what to do with me because they hadn't had that kind of success yet in their careers or in their role as a therapist. They'd seen a lot of heartbreak, but not a lot of success. And I hope somehow in my story and my interactions with therapists, I changed the paradigm.
Oh, I can
But
guarantee you that you have. Absolutely.
I'm just living my life now. I've got my life back. I've had
Wow.
a couple second chances. I'm a big believer in second chances. And I've got a life that, and I couldn't say this 10 years ago, that it's worth living. And the reason is because I didn't believe it was worth living. So God has really blessed me that He showed me that, I do have a purpose for being here, and that's enough. I really struggled for a long time with depression, suicidal ideation, just thinking my life was meaningless and that God couldn't use me, and if He was, that it was not the way I would have liked it. And finally, I've accepted where I'm at, and just thank the Lord I'm still here. Well, there are three things I want to say and get the points across.
Yeah, please do. The platform's all yours.
Thanks. Number one, there is a lot of hope for people with mental illness today, especially major ones like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, anxiety, depression. The hope is that there's the medication out there, understanding that every day they're coming up with more understanding of the brain. The hope is that the medications keep getting better and that people keep recovering and telling their stories and breaking down stigma by sharing what you can do with a mental illness and not what you can't. Secondly, the system actually, it's geared to actually work for people who let it work. And the whole problem the mental health system has isn't, it's financial. There's never enough to go around. I learned that economics. Economics is a study of scarcity, and the system doesn't get funded the way it could or should, unfortunately. And it could work a lot better with a little bit more oil grease in the skids. And finally, by sharing hope and sharing that the system works, hopefully that breaks stigma surrounding schizophrenia. Saying, look, just because you have this disorder, if you're responsible about it and you really try to do the right things like taking meds, staying away from drugs and alcohol, and doing what you can to give back to society, like working or volunteering, or just living your life in your own apartment, even if you're in a group home. If you can do those things and give back a little bit, you can have a good life. My mom didn't have the opportunity to have a good life. She died when I was 16, and she was on 18 meds, and none of them touched her psychosis. I never said that, but my mom actually had schizophrenia as well.
Wow.
And my dad was one of my biggest supports after my grandma passed away, and he actually would not let me go on disability because he saw potential that I could do something better with my life. This was when I wasn't doing as well either, and he was right. Right. And I hope people don't give up on themselves or their loved ones who have mental illness, because they can too. And that's my whole message. So can you.
Thank you so much for your time. I can't believe that almost an hour has gone by. It really did just fly by. You are a wonderful storyteller, and you've got a great story to tell.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Drawn Podcast, empowering women battling anxiety, depression, and other mental illnesses.